Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar where we'll be talking about better multi-tenancy deployments using Octopus Deploy. Before we jump straight in, a little bit of housekeeping first. There's no need to record this webinar as we'll be sending a link out to you by email after the last webinar has finished. There will be some time for some questions at the end of today's session, and there's a couple of ways to put your questions to us, either through the Zoom Q&A functionality, or if you head over to octopus.com/Slack, jump into the webinar channel and we'll pick your questions up from there. So, I'm Adam Close, and I'm a Solutions Architect here at Octopus Deploy, and joining me today is Mark Harrison. How are you today, Mark?
Yeah, I'm very well, thanks. Looking forward to this. The UK weather also got the memo, nice and sunny. But yeah, really looking forward to just unpicking some of the sometimes complex topic of multi-tenancy. How about you?
Yeah, really good, thank you. Yeah, and it's a topic I've been looking at for a while. We've updated the docs recently, so it's nice to talk about multi-tenancy and how it can be used better in Octopus.
Yeah.
So, what's on the agenda today? Mark's going to cover off different multi-tenancy application architecture patterns. Oh, wow, that's a mouthful. That we see at Octopus Deploy regularly, and what we've seen in previous roles before Octopus. Then we're going to jump straight into a demo. We see a couple of ways that people use Octopus to deploy multi-tenancy applications. We're going to cover those off. So that's a per project, per customer way of deploying, and also using environments per customer. Then what we're going to do is take one of those projects and convert that application to actually use tenants. So, Mark, I'll hand over to you to discuss the architecture patterns that we see at Octopus.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Adam. Thanks for that intro as well. As you said, multi-tenancy architecture patterns, that's a bit of a tongue twister. So what we're going to do is talk about three of the more commonly used architecture patterns to be deployed in Octopus. So the first one is single website and multiple database. Then we're going to talk about single website with a single database. And then lastly, we're going to talk about isolated infrastructure. And that's also the example we're going to use in the demo when we convert the application over, because that's typically the main use case for the multi-tenancy feature in Octopus. It was what it was originally designed for. So first one up is the single website and multiple databases. So in this model, you have a single code base that allows you to only manage one application or one website. Each customer gets their own separate database. So typically when a user logs in, they'll get a customer ID or a connection string that's attached to their login. We typically find that the connection string and any other configuration data lives in a separate configuration database. Now, when the code needs to go to a database to fetch some data, that connection string is pulled from the config database, or potentially a session if it's been saved when you log in. Now, the benefits of this model really are around cost. You can save because you're not having those dedicated resources. Each customer doesn't get their own virtual machine and website. Deploying the code is pretty easy, but deploying the databases is really the sticking point here. Databases need to be deployed to before the code is. Now, let's say you have a couple of databases, probably isn't that much of a concern, but if you have a few dozen or even a couple of hundred databases, that can make it more difficult to manage. There's also a risk of cross-tenant communication because everyone's using that same single website resource. So if you had an incorrectly configured connection string for one of those customers, you might get into a real sticky problem where one customer ends up seeing another customer's data. Adam, I think you've seen this model in a previous role, haven't you?
Yeah, it's probably the biggest experience I've had with a cloud product. It's how I first introduced Octopus into my previous company to actually deploy an application. It works well. Obviously, there's some trade-offs, and the reason why we opted for this model was purely the database that you talked about. We had a job of converting a client server model, so we had a application running, desktop application. Every customer had their own MySQL database and their own set of programs. We wanted to get that into the cloud. Obviously, the first case was rewriting the desktop application to a web app. What we decided to do for some regulations that we had to follow, there had to be no chance of data been mixed between customers. That was like the number one priority. So what we opted for there was a separate database, so they're all in kind of little silos. And we had that config database. So when a customer logged into our application, what it did, it looked up in the config database, said, okay, this is your database connection string, this is your database name, and then they're logged into their database. Now, it works really well. Deploying the website, fairly straightforward in Octopus. Okay, it was just they were easy to machines, part of a web farm. They were part of a load balanced application. And what we did is a rolling deploy. We took an EC2 machine out of the load balancer, updated it, put that back in. But like you said, that has to come second. The biggest challenge was updating all those databases. As every version we upgraded to, there were new database changes, whether they were schema changes or indexes. Now, if you're talking about a large database, adding those indexes in was time consuming. So eventually, when I left the company, we were deploying 5,000 databases. As you can imagine, running those scripts against every single database was very time consuming. So we had to think of lots of different ways how we could speed that up. The one good thing about it, if one of the database failed for whatever reason, we could just skip past that or fix it, continue on to the rest of the upgrade. So it wasn't a case of get to 4,500 databases, it failed, we had to do it all again. Luckily, I think we used guided failure mode in Octopus to kind of get around that.
Yeah, well, that's just the numbers are quite frightening. Like 5,000 databases. I think the maximum I've ever had to deal with, like in a single server, was like 50 max. I was talking some extreme scale there.
Yes,
absolutely. Okay, so moving on to the next model we see, and this is a single website, and a single database. So slightly similar to the previous one, except this time you have just one database versus one per customer. Now, I really see this as code-based multi-tenancy, because each user is assigned to a tenant or a company. When a user logs in, they're shown just that company's information. By far, it's the easiest option to deploy and maintain. Single code base, nice and easy to deploy and easy to manage. You've just got one item. Every table in the database that identifies the customer, usually using a customer ID column, and every query has something like where client equals Y, or customer ID or client ID equals the logged in customer ID attached to it. I think for me, the code-based multi-tenancy model here, the risk for cross-tenant communication is really high. A missed where clause on one of your new queries can make for a terrible day for your team. And I think one of the other things that isn't necessarily talked about as much is one client can directly impact another when you're using that same database. So if you have that situation where you've got a noisy neighbor running, I don't know, 4 years worth of administrative reports, that can affect the available resources for all of your other customers as well. Have you ever seen this model, Adam? I've not used it myself.
No, I haven't. I did think this was like the be-all and end-all of a cloud model. It was like the only way to go. In terms of how I see this is, it's really what we see often, or I see it often at Octopus. It's really easy to deploy. It's easy to build for, and it's easy to deploy. You know, you've got one website to deploy and one database. I think the trades-off probably are managing that application. You know, as you onboard more users, you need to make sure that that one website can handle all that traffic. Same with the database as well. You know, that database is going to get huge, and you know it's going to take a lot of maintenance. So probably the work we saw in the last one of actually upgrading the databases, they were all relatively small. The trade-off in this kind of scenario is easy to deploy, but the maintainability of that database just gets that little bit more. So yeah, it's something I've seen at Octopus, and it's, you know, it's a nice, easy way to deploy your applications.
Yeah, and I guess it's also potentially when you want to develop a particular feature for one of your customers, you have to put that behind like a feature flag as well, right? Because otherwise every customer is going to get that. So I guess for me, it requires a bit more discipline in your kind of development lifecycle, and you probably need like some potential guardrails to be successful, like say, to make sure that you don't accidentally write a query without the correct where clause, or the feature flags, all those kind of things that can help to make this model successful.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's happened somewhere before. You know, and somebody has got some data that they shouldn't have.
Yeah, and I'm sure it won't be the last time that's happened either. So moving on to the final one that we're going to talk about, this is isolated infrastructure. This is where, as the name implies, each customer or tenant gets a website or set of servers and a separate database. Now, as a result of this guarantees isolation from other customers. This can be useful for security, making sure that risk of cross-tenant communication is virtually non-existent, as each customer gets their own database and own set of resources. No customer's data is ever seen by another. The other thing that we talked about before, where we talked about the noisy neighbor situation, that can also be managed by this model, because if you do have any performance guarantees for a particular customer, because everything's isolated, you can make one database server particularly beefy if you need to deal with the neighbor that's got that 4 years of administrative reports. The code base is also pretty straightforward. No need to worry about looking up a customer's ID and maintaining that connection string somehow in memory. Usually, the deployment process in Octopus can be the same. It tends to find that the differences there are going to be things like deployment targets and the connection strings to the database, because obviously they're going to point at different servers. But it can be something that can be quite complex to manage. Again, it comes with scale. So the more customers you have, the more isolated infrastructure you therefore have, the servers to maintain, as well as database servers to maintain as well. Adam, I've used this in my last role. Have you used this one?
No, but again, I've seen it, and it does for me. What it offers is that flexibility. On two fronts. First of all, feature functionality. If you're a company that provides a service where you can make a customer can request alterations to the application, you can do those alterations without actually affecting other customers. So if they want to kind of pay for additional features, they can do that, and it's really easy to deploy that to one customer.
Yep.
Easier to control when a new release goes to a customer. Now, we saw in the last model, you had this single database, a single website. Now you can have some kind of, your slow ring, your fast ring to control who gets updates and when. But with the isolated infrastructure model, you can really hone down on when a customer wants, let's say, version 2.0.1. They can say, okay, I want that on this date, and they'll get that then, and it gives you that real control over when releases go to these customers, which is, it just offers that real flexibility. And the one thing I've seen as well is a combination of the isolated infrastructure and the code-based one that you talked about before, where you had the customers on the shared infrastructure, a shared DB, and then you also have this isolated infrastructure where it gives people that control that we're talking about now, and that flexibility of when they got updates.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Okay, thanks.
Cool.
So
Should we jump in?
yeah, let's jump into a demo then.
Cool. Let's jump into Octopus.
Okay, next. So what we're going to do next is I'm going to first talk about one of the models that we see to deploy a multi-tenancy style application, but without using the multi-tenancy feature in Octopus. Now, the first way of modeling it is this concept of using a project per customer. And when you look at the dashboard here, you can see vet clinic per project. We've got Capital Animal Hospital, Companion Care, and Pet Health Center at the bottom there, all as separate projects. This is quite nice to see from a dashboard perspective, Adam, because you can see dev, test, staging, and production. You know which version has been deployed to which customer in which environment. So from an overview perspective, it's really good. This is actually pretty similar to the way we model projects at my last company. So what we had there was each customer would have their own project, but they'd also have a project for a specific release. So you'd have like, in this example, Capital Animal version 5, and when they get to the next major release, they'd have Capital Animal v6. So if you go into the Capital Animal project deployment process, Adam, each customer would have their own project, and the deployment process was fully customizable for that customer. Like you said earlier with that isolated infrastructure model, if a customer wanted to pay for a particular piece of software development, we would do that for them. It would be reflected in the deployment process, not going to affect any other customer. It's going to get deployed just to their database and no one else's. And what we tend to have is we'd have a deployment process really kind of mixed up of two parts. One is this kind of like core elements that our change control team said, we had to send a notification like you see here. We send a Slack message. Then we had a manual intervention step where the release team need to make sure that it should be good to go. And then in the middle, usually towards the end, we'd have something like we have here on step 5, where we've got this custom branding. And this is like I was describing a second ago, where you have situations where a customer will pay for a specific software feature. You can add it in, and it's tailored specifically to them. So every time you don't want to onboard a new customer, we'd add a new set of deployment targets with roles that were specific to that project. And we actually ended up putting the customer identifier in with a role as well. This would allow us to make sure that one customer's targets didn't get the software run others. If you just switch over to the variables, Adam, as you can see here, we've got 3 variables: a database connection URL, database name, and a server name for the database as well. And they look relatively clean. They've been scoped to fairly standard environment names. But the one thing that we found with this model was there was a lot of duplication across projects. You'd have the same variables, but with different values. You'd have parts of the deployment process that were the same across all of those projects for each of those customers. And we really found actually creating this project structure was actually pretty easy. We used the REST API, and we actually built a software package to help us maintain that. But what we didn't do a great job of was, once we'd finished deploying version 5 for Capital Animal and we were going to move to version 6, was cleaning up after ourselves. So we ended up finding that we had a whole range of projects for these customers that were never cleaned up. So for me, we didn't do a good job of cleaning up old projects. And I think we really started to feel the kind of pain from that, like the scale of the number of projects we needed to create. We were fortunate in some respects that we had a monolithic application. So the deployment process actually had like almost 100 steps. And then what we would do is those projects, if you have a microservice style architecture, you'd need to create a project per customer for each of those microservices. So again, that kind of like doesn't scale particularly well. Have you experienced any other issues with this model, Adam?
No. A couple of questions for you in terms of how you used to manage some of these, some of the pitfalls of this. Just going back into the deployment process, what we can see is we always see this at Octopus. We have these like boilerplate steps that are in every project. Send a Slack notification to say the deployment's starting. Have a manual approval, and then jump down and have some messages, to say the deployment's done or it's failed. If you had to add this probably goes the same for variables as well. If you had to add a new boilerplate step in there, I don't know, an additional notification step, is that a case of going through and adding that to every single project? I imagine you could use the API, but you've got that additional overhead. And like I said, I suppose it's the same for variables as well. You need to add a new common variable across all the projects. So if the application's got a new app set in, it's a case of going in and adding that into every single project. I can imagine that was a pain to manage.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a couple of items there. So we typically there was a situation where we had to add in a check that would go and actually query Jira for whether or not a change control ticket had been approved to go to UAT or production for us. And that wasn't in any of our projects, so we had to add it. And I think at the time we had like 60 or 70 projects. So, as you said, you could manually come in and create them all, make sure all the variables line up to make sure that you've got the right URL to go to Jira, all those other bits. And it's all manual, right? It's all prone to human error. We did use the API, and we did get some success with that. But it's intricate, right? You have to know exactly the calls to make. You have to know exactly what you're doing. For variables, we ended up doing most of them manually, and the obvious feature that we could use in Octopus to kind of manage variables slightly better was we could use library variable sets. But because those variables aren't actually common, they really are specific to that project, because we also had version specific variables as well. So we needed to make sure that those variables would be there for each version, no matter what they are. So we'd end up having a variable set per project, which kind of goes against the point of having that variable set. So we end up just sticking with project variables. And I think for us, it was more better the devil like we were just, although it wasn't optimal for us, it did work. We deployed our software and it worked successfully. So it comes down to scale, really. It comes down to how many projects you have, what your deployment process looks like. This is a a deployment process here which has 7 steps. We had, upwards of between 100 to 120 steps per customer. But I think that's one of the other downsides to this model as well, is there's no consistency. You don't get consistency between these deployment processes because they can vary wildly. And that's where making those processes using the API are quite difficult, because you don't know that all of the steps aren't going to be consistent.
Yeah, and like I said, I mentioned I kind of focused on the cons there, but there is some, like I said, there's some benefits to this. You know exactly which customer's on which version. You've got a simple life cycle. You've got a simple environment set up. So there is some real process, and it is that isolated infrastructure as well.
Yes.
So if you change the deployment process, Capital Animal, you're only going to break, if it does break Capital Animal Hospital. It's not going to affect the rest of the customers. So that kind of leads on to, let's say, a different take on deploying the same model, but rather than using projects, what I do is jump back into the dashboard and look at the vet clinic. So these are all the per projects are all the vet clinic projects. However, rather than having a per project per customer for vet clinic in this time, we can see we've got Dev and Test, which is internal to us. We want to deploy to Dev and Test for our internal testing. Then we have this environment-based model where we base the customer as an environment in Octopus. So we can see we've got staging companion care, staging pet health, and then we've got the production environments for each of our customers. If we jump into the deployment process, you can see already that dashboard, it gets a little bit unwieldy, Mark. We've only got three customers in there. We can see
I can scroll bar, right?
Yes, definitely need that here. We can see I can follow the life cycle and deploy those the 3.2.10 version out to all those environments. Problem we see with that straight away compared to the per project is that scroll bar and that usability. If we jump into the process, you can see our life cycle on the right hand side here. We've got development when we deploy Dev and Test. Some customers, part of Vet Clinic, do pay for staging, and you can see that they're in the life cycle as well. And also, every customer-based environment is also in the production phase. So, first off, when you're adding a new customer in, it's a case of adding a new environment, whether that's staging and production. You also then go and have to modify the life cycle as well to include staging and production. So that overhead's kind of already creeping in there, which isn't too bad if you only got a couple of customers. Again, it's when you start scaling out.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, Adam, as well, like with the life cycle there, we've got 3 distinct phases. So we've got development, staging, and production. But it's not uncommon to see, development, staging, test, QA, UAT, production. So potentially for each one of those customers, if let's say they're not paid for, you'd have to add another environment in for each of those life cycle phases. So it can get pretty busy pretty quickly.
Yeah, definitely. But like I said, the one big pro of doing it this way is we have one deployment process. We have one project on one deployment process. Now, there are some tweaks we have to make to the deployment process to make sure only certain steps run for certain customers. So, for example, the apply custom branding. You talked about it before, where with your application, some customers may pay for additional features or functionality. In this case, they're paying for applying custom branding. So we come in, we jump in to make sure that this step runs for the right environment. It's a case of going in and actually choosing the customer-based environment. So every time you add a new customer in, it's a case of adding that new environment into there. So again, just a little bit of an additional overhead, but still, it's one deployment process to manage. So if I want to add a new boilerplate step in there, the one you mentioned about the Jira step, it's a case of adding that in once. So that gives us that kind of really usability around the deployment process.
Yeah.
It's
not repeated for each customer, is it?
No. So let's jump into variables, where it does slightly differ from the per project one, Mark. So we have 3 variables for this project now. We consider that quite small. We have the connection URL, database name, and server name. What I have to do is add a value for each of the environment and customer for each of the variables. So what we'll do is add a connection URL in, and then scope that to the environment, production, and the customer. Again, this works. It works for a small set of customers, but as you start adding more variables into here, it can get very unwieldy quickly. Now, we're going to convert this in just a second, and I'm going to have to pull some of these variables out. I know it's going to take me a while to make sure I pick up the right value, because the variable screen is great, but when you start adding in, hundreds of variables, values for one variable, it becomes difficult to manage.
Yeah, I imagine the biggest issue you have here is making sure that you've got the right value for a start, but also you've scoped it to the right environment. Because
yes,
if you don't, what you end up having is you go and do a deployment, and you're only going to find out at the deployment time that your connection string is incorrect, or that you've missed a variable completely, because you forgot to add that environment in.
Exactly. Yeah, you kind of just nailed that there. If we do add a new customer in, we add the new environment, we associate that to a deployment target, and then we add that to the life cycle. There's nothing really stopping us missing the variables. So you'd only find that out at the deployment time, which is pretty much too late. Easy to fix because it is isolated infrastructure. We can just go and add it in. But there's no guardrails there to kind of say, you need to make sure you put this variable in when you add a new customer. It comes back down to that kind of checklist sheet again. You got that Word document. If you've got a new customer, go into Octopus, make sure you've added the environment, the life cycle, and the variables. You kind of want to get out of that.
I thought you were going to talk about the Word document I used for deploying before I had Octopus. I was like, oh no, not that thing again.
Oh yes, no, they definitely got out of hand and outdated quickly. What I'll do is before we jump in and convert that, I'll quickly show you the infrastructure. So go to polling targets. So every customer gets their own polling tentacle. We jump in, and in this case, what we're doing there is they have the same target role, which is great as well. But what we have to do is they associate that to the deployment target with the environment that's been created for that specific customer as well.
Yeah, it's nice actually. That's the benefit of the target roles there. Is in my last one where you did project per customer, we ended up actually having to put the client code in to make sure that those targets didn't get deployed to, because we had no way of differentiating them. So yeah, makes sense.
Cool. Right, what we're going to do now, we're going to kind of take the existing vet clinic application and convert this over to use tenants in Octopus Deploy. So we've talked about some of the pitfalls there with, scale, there's no guardrails in terms of variables. I want to show how we can fix that with tenants. So what I'm going to do first is just going to clone this vet clinic application. Name a vet clinic tenanted. Save. So what I do is come down and jump to settings and just make sure we can actually deploy to tenants in this application. Now, Mark, we get a couple of options there. We get disable tenant deployments, allow deployments with and without a tenant, and then require a tenant. Do you know why you'd have deployments with and without tenants?
Yes, it's a question we get quite often. So this toggle really is there for allowing the multi-tenancy feature to be opt-in for a project. So as you can see, the default there is to be disabled. So when multi-tenancy was added in, I think it was Octopus 3.4, I'm showing my age now, what you had was the ability to turn it on or off. So if you weren't ever using multi-tenancy, like I wasn't in my last role, everything would carry on as normal. We made this feature opt-in. So the second one is allowing deployments with or without a tenant. So there's two main use cases I could see where you might want to use this. The first one is if you imagine you have a website where you're selling your own goods, and then you see an opportunity to white label your website and brand it for another customer, but essentially under the hood, it's still the same technology, the same site, right? What you might do is you might allow deployments with or without a tenant. So your tenant in this situation would be the customer that you've white labeled, but the untenanted deployment would be your own website that you're still deploying, right?
Yeah.
The second use case for deploying with or without a tenant is migration. So just like you're about to do when you're converting these customers over, if you want to do it piecemeal, so you want to do it part at a time, this allows you, in our example, to, let's say you did Capital Animal first. That could be a tenant. And then companion care could still go untenanted, but go to those customer environments. So it allows you mixed mode, if you like. And then the final one, require a tenant, would be where you've done all your migration and now you just want to do tenants to model your deployments.
Yeah, I suppose we could use the kind of hybrid for dev and test, but we're actually going to model dev and test as a tenant, as an internal tenant. And we'll talk about that and why in just a second. So I'm just going to enable acquire tenant for all deployments and just hit save. And then also what I'm going to do is jump into the deployment process. So we can see we've still got this lifecycle here. We have created another lifecycle for this tenant before we started this webinar, so you didn't want to see me creating all of the different phases of a lifecycle. So I'm going to change that. I'm going to change that to vet clinic tenanted. We can see here we've gone back down to the simple lifecycle phases of development, test, staging is optional for some customers, and then to production. So already we can see we're going to get rid of that environment-based lifecycle. Hit save on that.
Yes.
We're going to jump into tenants. So we've already created some tenants before, so we've got one for each of our customers, which is capital animal, companion care, and pet health. We also have this internal tenant. Mark, customers, people tend to assume tenants are customers. In this case of, okay, why don't you just call tenants customers? But tenants aren't just customers. They can represent a number of things. You know, it's kind of representing a thing or an object or a team. So we can say it could represent an actual individual tester, you know, Dave the tester. It could be a team that you're deploying to, or it can be a customer. It doesn't just have to be just customer focused.
No, I think it's one of the most common misconceptions of the multi-tenancy feature. And although we talk about in our documentation and to customers that it can be modeled for a multi-tenant SaaS application, it doesn't have to be the case. And we have many customers using tenants, some for regions. So you might have a geographical data center in a particular region that you want to model as a tenant, or you might have, as you said, like users or teams. So I think you said like you have a developer that wants to develop in isolation, and you can allow them only to deploy to development. And in the same way, you might have a tester that you want to have in exactly the same way. They can have isolated or shared infrastructure with tenants, and they can deploy out whichever branch of code they're testing in complete isolation, knowing that they're not going to impact another user or tester.
Yeah, and the reason why we're going to use internal today, we're going to use internal to actually deploy dev and test, and it's essentially we're going to create some variable templates for our tenants. And rather than having variable naming conventions for customers and then some different naming conventions for internal, we're going to use a tenant so we can keep the variable naming conventions the same. That'll make a little bit more sense when we create the project templates, the project variable templates. So what I do is jump into Capital Animal Hospital. So we already created this tenant. And what we need to do first, connect this up to our new project. So Vet Clinic Tenanted. This is where we have to link this now to our environment. Capital Animal Hospital, I only have production. They don't have a staging environment. So I was going to go ahead and just link that up to production.
I always think of the project connection as like a choice and a recipe, right? So like, the environments you get to see in that project when you're connecting it is based on the life cycle that you switch to, that vet clinic tenanted one. So development, test, staging, or production. But Capital Animal, they don't pay for staging, so therefore they only get production. So it's like a subset of those environments from that life cycle.
Yeah, it is. So we're still going to force a life cycle of a version, or at least go into dev and test. But then we obviously don't have to deploy the staging because Capital Animal Hospital is not actually linked to staging. So but it still follows the guardrails of the life cycle, but then gives us that kind of flexibility of which environments they can actually deploy to.
Nice.
So what I'll do, I'll just jump back and just link that companion care. They have staging and production. So I'll go on add that connection. I'm going to do the same for Pet Health Center. And they have staging and production as well. And lastly, go to internal. So internal, again, is going to be our internal tenant for deploying to dev and test. So connect that up to dev and test. Cool. So all those now filled out. So what I'm going to do is jump back into the project. And the first thing we're going to take a look at to try and improve is our variables mark.
Cool.
So I mentioned before, we looked at the screen. We've got all these variables. You know, how do we scope these to tenants? What we're going to use, I was going to just open up a new tab for now. We're going to use project templates. I'm not sure if you've used project templates before, Mark, but they are extremely useful.
Yeah, so in my previous role, I hadn't ever used them. Like I say, more of the fear of the unknown using tenants as a feature. But since starting Octopus, I have. The two main benefits I find with the project templates here is, first one is they're just treated like regular variables. So when you look at using one of these variables in your deployment process, it uses the same octostash variable substitution syntax we're used to. So there's no real change there. The other one, which is for me one of the more powerful aspects to this project variable templates, which you'll come on to showing just how easy this is once you've created a template and you're using those variables, those values that are created and added to a tenant don't get snapshotted as part of a release. So coming back to that whole kind of onboarding faff that we have to do when we're onboarding a new customer in any other type of model, not using tenants, what you end up doing is you create the new tenant, you provide the values for your project template, and you're good to go. No need to create a new release. You just take an existing one and deploy it out.
Yeah, exactly. What I'll do, I'll create the first template to kind of walk people through this. So again, this is the template. We're not filling in the variable values here for each tenant. That's actually done in the tenant. So all the manageability of these variables goes over to the tenant rather than the deployment process, which is key for scale and manageability. So all I do is just take the project database connection URL, a variable name, a nice name, connection, well, a control type, it's going to be a single line text box, so you can kind of force, again, additional guardrails on what you need to fill in for this variable type, and you get all the options that you get in the step template manager screen, Mark, when you create a new step template.
It's for the parameters, isn't it? That's same control.
Yeah. What we'll do is we'll add two more templates in, and what I'm going to use the same naming convention as my project. So these are all using my project. So rather than having to rename all my deployment process to use a different variable name for the templates, I'm just going to use the same name. Label, name, control type. And do the last one. So yeah, there's not too many to do, so you're not going to see me filling in variable templates all afternoon. MySQL server name. These will make a little bit more sense when we look at a tenant in just a second. So these are project variable templates that need to be filled in for our project deployment process to work whenever we deploy to a tenant. So I go and hit save and jump back up into tenants. You can see now I've got this exclamation mark. The reason why I've got this exclamation mark on each tenant is because there's project variable templates for the projects that we haven't filled in yet for this tenant. Again, guardrails to say, hey, you need to fill in these variables before you deploy to this customer. Go to Capital Hospital, jump to variables. What we can see now, those variable templates I've just created in the project are now available in the tenant. And we can see there I've got to fill these in for the production variables. So it's a little bit like that scoping where we talked about where you have to scope a value to an environment. This way, it's all managed through each tenant. It kind of gives you the isolation and just that little bit easier to manage. And again, the guardrails are here because it's forcing us to put in these variable values, so there's no chance they can be missed before deployment. So what I do, this is where I talked about before, I need to get some of these values. So I need Capital Animal Hospital connection string. So I'll just take a copy of that. And then also get the database name. And also the MySQL server name. And save. A quick refresh. Cool. See now they're filled in. And again, if somebody asks me, okay, Adam, can you jump in and change the MySQL server that Capital Animal Hospital is, connecting to? It's a case of coming into the tenants, searching for the tenant, and just updating the variable in here, rather than going into this screen and having to potentially break one of the scopes or update the wrong value. It's nice and clean in here. So I'm not going to fill those variables in for the rest of the tenants. We're just going to run a script off screen to actually update the rest of the tenants with their correct values. It's good to mention, part of, if you do go ahead and you want to migrate one of your projects to tenants, you can use the API to kind of make that transition a little bit easier. We do have some sample scripts to help with that, don't we, Matt?
Yeah, and it's good because you can also use it, particularly when you've got that model where you've got environment as customer scoped. You can actually write a script to then validate that your new templated variable values in tenants actually match your scopes for your project variables.
Yeah. I'll jump in just to quickly see companion care. We can see here they've got staging and production, so we have to fill in those variables for staging and production. Again, it's a much cleaner way of updating those variable values.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So while I jump into next, if we go back to the project, what I'll do is jump into infrastructure. I'll take up these polling tentacles again. I mentioned this before. Capital Animal Hospital production has this environment, and this is how we knew when we deployed to this target it went to the correct environment. We can actually get rid of that now, and we can put this part of the generic production environment. One of the great things about this Mac is cutting down on the amount of environments that I've got in this. This Octopus instance. One of our recommendations is always keep your environments below 10 if possible. So it's helping do that, and to make sure when we deploy our application to a tenant, that it goes to the correct deployment target. And we go down here. We've got tenanted deployments. This tenant is allowed to be deployed in a tenanted and untenanted deployment. All I have to do is just associate this with the correct tenant.
It's nice though as well. The tenanted deployments there, it matches what you saw with that project deployment setting for multi-tenancy, right? You can have that kind of mixed mode. You can say exclude it completely, which is the default, or you can say actually once you've migrated all your environments over to tenants, include it only in tenanted deployments.
Yeah, definitely. Go ahead, save. Again, rather than watching me go through the rest of the infrastructure, and they was going to run a quick script off screen, which will update the rest of the infrastructure. So again, if you are migrating, we've got scripts to do that. We can see now companion care production is now just production. It's linked to the tenant. Okay, last thing I want to cover off before we actually go ahead and deploy. Jump back into the project. And we mentioned about this, the additional steps that some customers have when we're deploying. So we obviously applied custom branding, and we only run this for particular environments. Now those environments have gone. We want to be able to make sure this step runs for any existing customer and new customers that come on board that have paid for additional branding, and we need an easy way to do that. We don't want to be coming to the deployment process every time and adding something into the filter list and the run conditions to say only run for certain tenants or certain environments. What we can do, we can take advantage of what's called tenant tag sets. So what I'm going to do is create a new tenant tag set. I'm going to call that customer my spelling is terrible. Whilst it is, we'll go that one. Customer customizations, and jump to tags. We want a tag for branding. Now, what tenant tag sets and tags allow us to do is allow us to actually tag a tenant with a specific tag, and you'll see in just a second when I update the deployment process, I have a step that runs for all tenants with a particular tag. So we have this concept of branding. Customers pay for specific branding, and what I need to do is associate this tag with all the customers that have paid for additional branding. I'm going to go ahead and hit save and go back into tenants. We only have one customer that pays for the additional branding in Vet Clinic. Go in and manage tags. We can see here we've got the tenant tag screen. We can jump in here. We can say Capital Animal Hospital has paid for custom branding. So we're going to tag that tenant with that tag and hit save.
It's a really nice way, isn't it? I'm sorry, just to interrupt.
Yeah.
The tenant tag there is really powerful because, as you said, you're able to add new tenants and add them to have that branding tag or any other tag for that matter. And you can just, you don't no need to change the deployment process. It already applies to that tenant when you go to do deployments.
Yeah, and we'll see that in just a second with how we'll change the deployment process. The idea behind this and the variables is any kind of configuration that you need to do per customer is done in the tenant. So if you need to apply additional features or variable or variables, you can do all this through the tenant screen, and it's managed through there, and it's not managed through changing the deployment process or changing the variables in the deployment process. It's all done through the tenant screen. So yeah, we're actually saying, okay, there's less to kind of fill out in terms of variables. We're not cutting down the amount of variables that you need. We're just kind of putting up guardrails putting guardrails in place and making it more usable and maintainable.
Yeah.
So go jump to the deployment process back in there. What we're going to do is just change this step to get rid of the environment. So it's not going to run for specific environments this time. It's going to run for any environment. We get this nice option of the tenant tags. So we're going to say that this runs for any tenants that have got the branding tag. So again, we never have to come in and change that deployment process again. It's all done through the tenant. And hit save. And again, those tenants can be scripted. New customer comes on board. Okay, did they have branding? Did they have staging? Here's the script, and it's up and running without changing the project. So cool. That's everything kind of migrated over. What we'll do is we'll jump up and we'll create at least see what this looks like when we're actually deploying. So I'll just deploy this out. The first file we're going to go to is development. So again, we've got these guardrails still. It has to go to development first, then test. So it's already picked the internal tenant for us. I'm going to hit deploy. Hopefully I haven't used too big a package as this takes a while, Mark.
Fingers crossed.
So you can see, first of all, for development and test, it's not going to run the custom branding step. As you can see that there. What we'll do is we'll jump out to the overview screen to see kind of what it looks like in there. So again, this was all about the view that we get when we're deploying to these customers as well. So, can we tell which versions are where? You can see we've got 0 to 0, 1 deploying to internal. One of the options that you do have when we're going to either staging or production, which is great, rather than having to deploy this out to every customer, we do get the deploy all button as well. So once you're ready for this to go to all customers in production, you kind of hit deploy all and it'll go. So we'll apply that to test. Okay. Again, let's go back to the overview screen. Sort that out. So again, those guardrails are still there, Mark. The lifecycle says go to development first, go to test, and we'll see the different options we get when we deploy into staging and production.
I was just about to say I really like that overview because it gives you a very clear indication of which customers can have that release to which environment. It's really neat that you get those guardrails exactly as you said. It's spot on.
Yeah, and it's kind of like the per project. So you still get that kind of view of the per project of what's in staging and what's in production still. Yes. So what they do. So we can see now this is where we linked the environment up to just Capital Animal just to production, so they don't get staging. So what we're going to do is deploy companion care to staging. Because they're happy for that to go to their staging environment. Go back to the overview screen. And what I'm going to do is Capital Animal, so I've said, yep, they're ready to deploy to production. Go ahead and deploy that out straight to production. And jump into overview. You can see now they're getting kicked off and they're getting deployed. What I'll do is go to the dashboard. And what I do is just quickly create a new project group. Save. Oh, it exists. That's fine. What I'll do is just change the project group to multi-tenanted. Save. Go to my dashboard. You can see here on the main dashboard now again. So it's much like your VetClinic per project, Mark.
Yeah.
But rather than having multiple projects, we've got one. One thing that you did show me before we did this webinar, which is great, you have these little labels on staging and production. So we can see we've deployed to one of 3 tenants, and that's what kind of that little indicator is, which is nice to see as well. What we do is jump back into the process, into the project, sorry. Now, if we take a look at Capital Animal Hospital, I always do that one. Production. We can see there it's ran the additional custom branding step for Capital Animal Hospital as well.
Nice. That's pretty awesome.
Cool. So cool. That's us taking a deployment model that particularly doesn't scale well and doesn't have those guardrails to use tenants, kind of make it more, this deployment more maintainable and usable. So with that, kind of wraps up the demo, Mark. What we'll do is jump back over to our slides and hopefully some questions. So do we have any questions?
So I think we've got a few questions come in. So let's just have a quick look. So the first one, Adam, is one from an anonymous attendee. They said, we have hundreds of tenants for a single project with up to 5 environments: dev, test, UAT, pre-prod and prod. Is there a way to produce a report on versions of our product for a specific environment? Having our stakeholders log into Octopus to derive this information is tricky.
Yes, that's a very good question. So there's a couple of options to kind of pull data out of Octopus. So you could use the Octopus CLI to kind of dump out a report of XML data, but I'm not sure if that we're kind of giving what you need in terms of tenants. It's going to kind of pull a lot of information about all the Octopus releases. The other option that you have is just kind of use the Octopus API. Obviously, Octopus API first, so you can get to any data that you see in Octopus through the API, and you can kind of cut that up how you need. What I would recommend, because it is a great question, is our product team are doing a lot of work at the moment on reporting and insights with Octopus. So if we could put that question to our team, Mark, on adviceoctopus.com, we could kind of delve into a little more what he wants to see in a report, and also share that with our product team. I think that'd be really valuable information for them.
Yeah, I agree. That's a great thing to do. Cool. So we've got another couple of questions in. So the next one is from David Hutchison, who says, how does multi-tenant affect licensing? How are targets calculated? So in terms of licensing costs, the feature itself is included in Octopus, so you don't have to pay extra for any of that. In terms of deployment targets, it's exactly the same as normal targets. So tenants don't affect that specifically. You can still use like shared infrastructure. So if you have more than one tenant on one deployment target, that would be one deployment target for your limit. And likewise, if you have isolated infrastructure where you had one deployment target per tenant, obviously you could multiply that out per environments, then they just count as individual targets. Cool. So another question from Andre. Is it possible to define common variables for staging? Adam, do you want to take that one?
Yes, I wonder if you can show that. Yeah, it's certainly possible. So towards that question, is it possible to find? Yes, so in terms of if you used a project template variable, you can then, I think I showed that on the first part of the demo. I'll just quickly go over there. If I go to tenants, I think it was companion care and variables. So there we had the staging variables because it was linked to both staging and production, and we've got those production variables as well. I think that answers the question, Mark.
Yeah. Let me see. So we've got one which says we have a number of clients who provide their own hosting on their own infrastructure, which we need to access via a VPN. do you have any suggestions on how to integrate a VPN connection into the tenant deployments? I think that's probably one that we'll take offline. So Jared, if you wouldn't mind dropping an email to us at advice@octopus.com, and then we can give you some suggestions on that one. Awesome. Let's see. We've got another one over here. Can you manage SSL certificates for different tenants? Yes, you can. Adam, would you mind going to the library for us for a sec? If you go to certificates, that's it. And so we created one here earlier, and this is just for our vet clinic internal tenant that we talked about. So this is just a self-signed one, so for demo purposes only. But in exactly the same way that you can associate tenants with deployment targets, you can do exactly the same under the restriction section here. So you can have two things in play here. One is the tenant association with the certificate themselves, and the second one is you can also use different certificate variables as part of those project templates that Adam showed earlier, and therefore you can have different certificates specific to your tenants, both in different environments as well.
Okay. It's also worth noting you can set up a subscription for that as well, can't you, Mark? So if the certificate was ever to expire, or it's going to expire in a number of days, you can set up some kind of warning to notify yourself that it's going to expire, so you don't find out on the day.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got one other question over here as well, Adam, for you. What was the purpose of the internal tenant again?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And the reason why I chose to use that is so I didn't have untenanted and a tenanted deployment. You can use either. And the reason I did it was just to kind of keep all my variable naming conventions the same for dev and test, and put those guardrails in place of dev and test environments, as well as my customer tenants as well. But we could have used an untenanted deployment for dev and test. It works pretty much the same. I just have to add some variables into my project variables rather than my project template variables.
Cool. Okay, I think that's probably all of the questions we have time for now, Adam. For anyone that we didn't get to answer your questions, if you drop us an email at advice@octopus.com, and we will be happy to answer them for you.
Well, thank you, Mark. I kind of wrap this up then. So just a few resources before we finish today. If you have got a problem with your Octopus instance or having trouble, get in touch with our support team at support@octopus.com. If you get any licensing queries, go to sales@octopus.com. And if you ever have a question of, you haven't got a problem with Octopus, but you want to know how to do something or get the best practices, email the advice@octopus.com team. That's a team myself and Mark working, and we'll be happy to help you there. And then last couple, while we were building this webinar, we also made a lot of changes to our docs. So if you head over to octopus.com/docs/tenants, you'll find a number of new guides in there, and one kind of relating to the one we've just done on this presentation today. And lastly, if you want to be kept up to date with all our webinars, if you can go over to youtube.com/octopus deploy and just go on there and click subscribe, you'll be notified of any new videos that we release. So thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you, Mike, for joining me. It was a great webinar. In terms of things coming up, we're having a break from webinars in August. Basically, we're all hands on deck with configuration as code, which we'll be doing something with that in September 2021, and the details of that will be coming soon. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.